My guest today is David Brickman, violinist from the Amenda Quartet. Welcome, David. So glad you could come in.
Thank you, Eric. I'm glad to be here.
Well, string quartet is just a wonderful medium, a very intimate expression of music, and there's a ton of music written for it. So tell us a little about how you started your quartet and what your activities are.
Well, the Amenda Quartet formed, we formed in about 2009 or so, and we formed to perform the Beethoven string quartets. There are 16 of these.
Oh.
Each one is a masterpiece.
Yeah.
They span the master's life from his early years in his 20s in Vienna to the end of his life. He spent that whole period of his life in Vienna. And you know, everybody knows the Beethoven symphonies. They know Beethoven Symphony No. 5. Can I give a quick?
Yeah.
So everybody knows this piece. Everybody knows how great it is. They know the Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy. Every bit as great are each of these 16 string quartets. From a musician's point of view, there's a real difference between playing in an orchestra and playing in a string quartet. The orchestra, as a violinist, you're one of 30 perhaps players, and your part, the notes that you're playing are exactly doubled. The same exact notes are being played by these other violinists. And so your primary goal is to fit in and blend in with this. And of course, it can be ecstatic to play in a symphony orchestra. If all the pieces are in place and the conductor is great and you're playing great music and everybody's on board, you can be part of something bigger and greater than yourself. Especially if the conductor, you know, I've had the good fortune to play with some really good conductors. I played with Leonard Bernstein.
Wow.
And to participate in that is to get inside his mind, to be part of his musical vision. And this is, I don't know, people talk about playing tennis with a better player. Raises your game.
All right.
So to be involved in what Leonard Bernstein is thinking on music is an art that happens in real time. So you're part of this process, and that can be
That's thrilling.
Extremely thrilling, yeah. But yeah, most of us go into music because we have something that we want to express personally. And for a section player in a symphony orchestra, this is not the at least for me and for many, not the ideal place to express individuality. So a string quartet, we get the best of both worlds because it's an ensemble and there's dialogue with the other players, musical dialogue as well as the traditional form in rehearsal. But in addition to this, there's also a chance for individual expression because you're the only person playing your line. And this allows for, when you work with a quartet for years, as the Amenda Quartet have worked together, we get to know each other very well, and it enables us a really high degree of spontaneity in performance. So it doesn't have to happen exactly the same way. If somebody wants to take a little extra time here, make something just a little more tender or a little more ferocious or driving, you can count on your colleagues to be there. And this is also thrilling. So that's why we wanted to do this.
I see. So now, in a string quartet, just to be clear, how many of what kind of instruments are there?
So a string quartet is 4, of course. It's 2 violins. I'm a violinist, and so the other violin is the same instrument. And then there's a viola and a cello. A viola is basically like a big violin. It plays just a bit lower. And cello is like a really, really big violin. They're all members of the same family, and they have the same kind of construction. And with this similarity of construction comes a potential for the highest degree of matching of sounds. And so this has attracted composers starting from Haydn over 200 years ago until the present day. Stringed instruments also have the capability of tremendous coloristic variety. Can I do another little demonstration? So we can play the most wispy kind of sounds. Or the most rustic or aggressive, earthy sounds. We can play ghostly, fluty sounds. And we can play glassy, sounds. And so the string quartet has the possibility to blend and make one completely homogeneous sound, but there's also a palette, a huge palette of color possible. I mean, even one violin making up nonsense can make tremendous colors in the hands of a composer like Debussy, and there's plucking. So tremendous possibilities there. And this has attracted composers since Haydn to do their very greatest work. Almost every truly great composer that you can think of has contributed string quartets, and in almost every case, those quartets rise to the top of that composer's oeuvre, his output of work. And so, I mean, the composers that don't fit the bill are, you can name them on one hand. Chopin didn't write string quartets.
Pianist guy.
Yeah, mostly for piano.
Sure.
But Mendelssohn, Schubert, Mozart, Brahms, Shostakovich, Bartók, Beethoven, all wrote great string quartets. And so we have this smorgasbord of
well, that's phenomenal. So now, if there is no Bernstein, then how does a quartet negotiate its overall interpretive shape of the piece, etc.?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, there's no conductor. We don't have a drummer. And so when it comes to just the nuts and bolts of sticking together, it depends primarily upon good rhythm and a high level of sensitivity to one another. And so everybody has good rhythm, but in a great string quartet, there's tremendous flexibility. That's what I was speaking about when I was talking about spontaneity. And so this good rhythm has to be combined with real awareness of what's happening in the moment. This makes playing in a string quartet it's complete. You have to be completely involved in it. There is some amount of conducting. We don't like to use that word. We call it leading.
Sure.
And so at the beginning of a piece, there will be physical gestures from, usually the first violinist plays, leads these things. But one of the great things about a string quartet is that it's an egalitarian society, very unlike a symphony orchestra, which is much more like a military. You've got your conductor at the top, and you've got the concertmaster and the other principal players of their instruments, and they lead their sections. And so there's this hierarchy. But in a string quartet, there's this equality. All four voices are equal, and so sometimes the leading is done by other players, and often we like to say, let's everybody lead this, and this helps us really stay together.
That's terrific. Well, and so now, are the violin parts equal, or do you switch back between first and second?
Yeah. In terms of composition, I think it's valid for one to think about the quartet the way one thinks about a choir. So the first violin could be considered the soprano voice, and the second violin, the same instrument, not a different instrument, plays the alto voice. And so though they have the same range and capacity, usually the second violin plays a little lower than the first, and lower still is the viola, and then the cello is at the bottom, and so
bottom
that's
of
the
the
way
texture.
that
I
works.
see. So, and you can share those roles, and sometimes the other instruments get the lead role also.
That's right. So the cello may have the melody. The cello may have the melody as the lowest voice, but sometimes the cello has a tremendous range, even bigger than the violin. I mean, a violin has about 4 good octaves.
Yeah.
A cello has about 5 good octaves. So it's, I don't think. Yeah, even Beethoven wrote quite high for the cello sometimes, but especially later composers would exploit that top register of the cello, which can be a marvelous sonority.
Now, if I go to a string quartet concert, am I going to hear music that's familiar to me in terms of its shape and its layout? If I've been to, for instance, a classical concert at the Philharmonic.
Yeah, absolutely. The forms, the musical forms, the way the music is constructed is the same. So a Mozart symphony usually will have 3 or 4 movements. A Mozart string quartet will usually have 4 movements. And just as his symphonies will have a particular pattern of movements, the quartets are likely to have that. So typically you'll have a fast movement, followed by a slow movement, followed by a movement in 3/4, a minuet. In Beethoven's case, it could be a scherzo. Which
kind of a dance-inspired piece or a joyful one.
Right, scherzo is like a fast minuet, and then usually the finale is another fast movement. Beethoven, the composer who inspired us to start this whole crazy project, he started breaking out of those traditions, and so one of his late quartets has 7 movements, but they're all joined together, and there's thematic continuity. So he'll take, in Mozart's day, he would have a theme in the first movement, and once that movement was over, you'd never hear that again. But later composers started taking one idea, and it would come back later, which would give a beautiful arc to the music, which audiences perceive. Right. One of the things that the Amenda Quartet really loves to do is to play for diverse audiences. We love playing for audiences who are less familiar with classical music, because one of the great satisfactions is just is for us to play the music. You know, we get great satisfaction out of just the playing, but we also find it very rewarding to bring music to people, the music that we play, to people who are unfamiliar with it. And we've had a lot of success. We've had people come to our concerts who've literally never heard classical music live before. And I think, you know, classical music in some quarters, in some communities, has sort of a bad rap. It's elitist music, or it's incomprehensible music. And of course this is not true. It's what classical music is the greatest geniuses, human geniuses who've lived over the centuries, recording in this extraordinary art form their most beautiful, intimate, brilliant expressions of the human experience. And what an extraordinary thing that 4 living human beings can sit down, look at ink blots that a guy who lived 250 years ago placed on paper, bring it back to life for a one-time only event. It never happens the same way twice. And this message from the mind and heart of one of humanity's greatest geniuses is transmitted in real time to a living audience.
It's with tools that really haven't changed since their day.
That's right. This violin, you know, the way this violin is constructed is more or less the same as it was invented by a fellow named Amati back in,
Amati being an Italian guy, but
Italian
where
guy
was this
400 years ago.
Yeah.
This instrument was made in Brooklyn. This is made by in the shop of a violin maker called Sam Zygmuntovich. This one is a so-called shop of Zygmuntovich. If I look in at the little label there, it says shop of Zygmuntovich. And that means that one of the traditions of violin making is to have an apprentice system. And so most luthiers have apprentices, and Sam's apprentice did a lot of the work on this one under his guidance. And when I went to try it out, I had the option of a couple of Zygmuntovich violins and this shop of Zygmuntovich, and I got a little bit of a bargain on it because it was a shop of, and I thought it sounded great, and so I've been pretty in love with it since I got it in '98.
Well, it's certainly an impressive instrument. And, you know, it's amazing the investment that professional musicians put into these instruments, and to hear them up close and personal in a string quartet setting is very exciting. Now, you know, it seems to me that it would be very useful for an audience to be able to hear the kind of comments you've just been making about how the music is put together and how the quartet works together. Do you talk to the audience at your concerts?
This is one of the things. Yeah, when I say we love bringing it to people, this is one of the ways. I mean, there are 2 ways that we do it. We play it and we discuss it, and we mix it up too. And so, if we're playing a very long concert, we won't do a lot of talking. One of my cardinal rules is send them home wanting more. And so we, if we're playing 3 full-length string quartets, we probably won't say much more than hello. Hope you like it. But we do a lot of concerts where we'll just play 1 string quartet, and so the whole event, the whole performance will be about that single work. And so we'll demonstrate themes from it. We'll show how the composer takes that theme and develops it. He turns the music upside down. Listen how these 2 pieces fit together. Now listen how, for example, Beethoven studied with Haydn. We'll play an example from Haydn. You see what Beethoven learned from his teacher. You see how Beethoven went beyond what he learned from his teacher. And familiarity is a huge part of falling in love with this music. Sometimes it is puzzling, especially, for example, late Beethoven. The man was deaf at the end of his life, isolated in a sense. And so I was just looking over one of the scores of the late Beethoven, and I almost felt like I was a voyeur because it seemed like I was peering into the most personal aspects of the man's mind. It's almost silly because, of course, he wanted these quartets to be heard and understood, but it's so personal, and it can be quite difficult. I mean, this guy was a great genius, and you can't always immediately understand everything about it. In fact, for us, that's one of the things that's so great is as many years and decades as we pour into it, if you're working on music by one of the great geniuses, you're always finding something more.
Yes.
Something more in it. And so it's great to take this music apart a little bit, show how it's put together, and this helps people fall in love with it. And that really, in a word, is what we're interested in, is people loving the music as we do.
Now, do you work from the scores in the quartet, or do you see only your own part, and what's the process of putting it together? How do you know what the others are doing?
Yeah, so the score is the place, that's what the composer wrote, and you can see all four voices lined up, as you know.
Yeah.
And then the parts, we see only our own part. And usually string quartets play from parts. However, we study the score, we learn the score, and we're always listening. That's one of the great things about being a musician, is trying to hear more, trying to hear everything. I think one of the things that might be kind of mind-boggling to a layperson is imagining a conductor working with 100 players and managing to hear everything that's going on, and that is a real feat. Not quite as hard in a string quartet. On the other hand, when you're playing in a string quartet, you're doing something very intricate.
Yeah.
Playing a violin is not easy, or a cello, or a viola.
Yeah.
And so we do study the score. We usually play from our parts. If you're playing a modern piece that's really thorny, really hard, sometimes we'll read off of scores, and occasionally there'll be little cues. We'll put in little cheat notes. That's one of the ways we prepare is you take your part, you take the score, and you say, okay, second violin has a quarter note on the second beat there, and then you're prepared. You're listening for that. By the time the concert rolls around, it's ingrained enough. You don't have to bring it to a intellectual level. It's in your bones.
Yes. I was reading in the New York Times just recently about the New York Philharmonic that had done a concert of Mozart music, which for these players, top masters in their field, is quite easy in terms of the technical demands. But the conductor was mentioning how many decisions are required. He said it's unbelievable the number of decisions, how long and how short and how loud each note happens to be. And so how do you make those decisions in a quartet setting?
Well, this is true. I've occasionally been impressed with, sort of looked for a moment from the outside at what we do, especially in the orchestra. Because, a string quartet will spend more time preparing for a piece for a concert than an orchestra will. Typically, an orchestra will have between 1 and 4 rehearsals to get something together. So, for example, I played in the Rochester Orchestra for many years. We'd see the music for the first time Tuesday morning. We'd finish rehearsing Thursday morning, Thursday night, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, our performances, and then it's gone. And so you have to, and this is a whole program, not just one piece. And so in the space between Tuesday morning and Thursday night, there are literally thousands of details that you learn and recall and execute. And at a professional level, you better get, if there were 3,474 things that you were supposed to learn, you better get 3,471 or 2 of them, or you're just not cutting it. In a string quartet, now most of that is much of that is supplied by the conductor. So the conductor, if things are going as they should, the conductor is determining the tempo, which is the main and first thing that's got to be decided. How fast or slow should this music go? Everything else hangs on that decision. And then there are all kinds of other decisions. I mean, if you got 100 players on the stage, it says in their music how loud they play. Forte, piano, these Italian terms that mean loud and soft. Well, what's a forte? If you're playing in the second violin section and you have important music in sort of a dull register of your instrument, and there's trumpets and thick stuff going on, a quiet dynamic might be close to as loud as you can play. If you're accompanying a flute concerto and the flute's in the bad register and there's a lot of orchestration, a lot of people are playing, the loudest dynamic might be just about as soft as you can play. So there's a tremendous amount of interpretation that happens.
True.
The players do a lot of that on themselves, but the conductor has the final say. And the conductor shows this with gestures and facial expressions and body language.
And brings well-marked parts, for instance. And
If you're lucky, he or she is prepared and the parts are well marked.
Right.
In a string quartet, there's no conductor, and so all this decision-making happens democratically, which is one of the reasons why it takes longer.
Yeah, I see. Sure.
There's no one calling the shots. You have to come to agreement, and this is one of the pleasures and one of the frustrations and challenges of. It's not uncommon to hear people compare being in a string quartet to a marriage. You spend a lot of time with them, and you got to work together. And musicians sometimes have very, very strong feelings about how something should go. It's not uncommon for us to have ego connections with what we do.
No way.
And so in a rehearsal, you got to say, I think that was too loud. I think you're flat there. I think you're too sharp. And so this process. It's harder in a string quartet than in an orchestra because of this democracy, but it's also, it's worth it.
Yeah, I was remarking at the power when I heard a recent performance of the Amenda Quartet, at the power of the sound with just 4 instruments to generate that much sound and that much presence in the room is really striking.
Yeah, I think most people don't realize how powerful a good instrumentalist can, how loud and powerfully they can play. And I'm not a great acoustician, but my understanding is that when you add one violin, you don't double the volume. Maybe it's 10% more of the way. This is the way acoustics work. And so four players are not that much softer than a full orchestral string section. I mean, it's not proportional.
That's remarkable.
So it can, and the other thing about chamber music, its name suggests a room which being performed in a chamber, and so I think the guys writing a couple hundred years ago, this is what they were envisioning. They weren't envisioning the Eastman Theater with 3,000 seats for a string quartet, and so we like playing in intimate places because it gives us the opportunity to play with the most intimate expression. Now, once you've established this bottom level of quietness and drawing people in, then when suddenly you speak loudly, this contrast creates power and drama. And we depend on that because a violin's not a trombone. There's no snare drum, and so we don't have the sheer decibels, but we got enough.
Well, maybe you get instruments that match well. Does your violin, for instance, match the sound of the other instruments? Brass quintets will sometimes buy instruments by the same maker. Do you?
Yeah, we're the Amenda Quartet is not a full-time string quartet in that it's not our primary livelihood. Patty, the other violinist, and Melissa play in the Rochester Philharmonic. Mimi teaches at Eastman. I have a business called Body Mind Float Center, which is completely unrelated to music. And so our primary livelihood is elsewhere. We don't get to rehearse. We usually rehearse about twice a week, which is a lot for us. But a touring string quartet is likely to rehearse 4, 5, 6 times a week.
I see.
And so we didn't, we all have instruments that we love, and that's what we play in the group. Maybe if we were doing it every day and that was our main thing, we would think in those terms. But actually, it hasn't ever come up in rehearsals. Most of what comes out of your instrument is what you put into your instrument, what you create in your mind.
How you're
and
hearing
so,
the piece.
if you hear some great violinist pick up a junky violin, man, they're going to sound great on it. They may not prefer it. They may not want to play a big concert on it because it may not project over the orchestra in the same way, and they're not quite used to it. But you hear Jascha Heifetz, he died in 1988, so and you won't have this opportunity, unfortunately. You can hear him play a lot on recording, but if he were to pick up a $30 antique store violin, you would know that's Jascha Heifetz in one note.
Ah, man, that's amazing. Now, you mentioned recordings. Do you listen to other performances of the music that you're working on? Do you have reference recordings, or how do you research your interpretation?
Well, with a composer like Beethoven, we've all been playing his music our whole lives. We've been playing not only his quartets, but his violin sonatas and his cello sonatas and his piano trios and the symphonies and the opera. And so we're so immersed in his music that we understand a lot about the way he's thinking already. It can be instructive and inspiring to listen to fine performers on recording playing the music that you're preparing, but ever since I was a young guy, I found that to be a little treacherous. Actually, when I was a very young guy, I was quite in the habit of doing that. But as time has gone by, I've moved away from it because I want to depend on my instincts, my knowledge, my imagination, and that of my colleagues, more than somebody else's ideas. It's easy to be influenced by other players, especially if they play beautifully, and it robs you of the chance for your full creative power.
So wonderful exploration happening and some discovery in the process.
Yeah. So we try to find a balance. If you pick up a piece and somebody says, "Can you play this next Tuesday?" and you've never played it before, you go listen.
You go check it out. Well, now, if you've been spending this time on the Beethoven string quartets, what kind of projects can our audiences look for from Amenda in the future, coming years?
Well, we haven't only played Beethoven. When we've produced our own concerts, it's usually Beethoven. Not infrequently, we're asked by some presenter, some series to play, and they occasionally they have a guest artist in mind, usually a pianist, and they want us to play with this pianist, and there's no Beethoven string quartet and piano music, so we'll play other composers for that reason. We haven't spoken a great deal about what's coming next. There's a cycle of 6 Bartók string quartets. There are other cycles to do, but variety is the spice of life, and so maybe we'll be done with cycles. I can't say, but it's exciting to imagine it, and whatever happens, we'll be looking for diverse menus. We'll be looking for opportunities to share the music not only through our performances, but through speaking about it and engaging with people on a personal level, so they will start to love it.
Wonderful. And so I've seen that you've performed at Rochester Institute of Technology. Are you performing in other venues, and are these concerts expensive to get to, or?
I'd like to say that people can visit our Facebook page, Amenda Quartet, and that's Amenda, not Amanda. Amenda was a great friend of Beethoven's. Amenda Quartet. We also have a website, amendaquartet.org, and you can find out where our concerts are. Part of our mission to bring music to as many people as possible involves giving free concerts. So occasionally you can come hear us and not pay a dime to get in. And when we have presented our own concerts, we do it on a sliding scale. So there's a suggested donation, and we genuinely mean that it's a suggestion. And so we never want finances to be an impediment from somebody coming to hear us play. So if you can't, if you can spare a buck, we're grateful for that. If you can't, if there's nothing, we want you to come hear us play.
Highly recommended. Thank you. My guest has been David Brickman of the Amenda Quartet. Thank you, David. Thank you. It was great to have you.